Section 1. The Spark. A 24-year-old with $50,000 and a dream. Picture this. It is 1998. A 24-year-old kid from Kent, Connecticut, who had spent his entire childhood sketching cartoon characters on anything he could find, walks into a room at Fox Broadcasting with a handmade animated film tucked under his arm. The film cost him $50,000 to produce, which Fox had given him after seeing a couple of short films he had made years earlier during his time working at Hanna-Barbera, where he wrote for shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. He animated most of this new pitch film himself. He worked on it for 6 months straight in something close to isolation, pouring every comedic idea, every character instinct, every specific observation about family and stupidity and human nature that he had been sitting on since he was a student at the Rhode Island School of Design. He was the youngest executive producer in the history of network television. He had no certainty that any of this was going to work. And when the Fox executives watched what he had made, they immediately greenlit a full series. The kid's name was Seth MacFarlane, and what he had just sold was Family Guy. There is something almost impossibly romantic about that origin story when you let yourself sit with it for a quiet moment. A single human being, working largely alone, building something from nothing, drawing on animated shorts he had created years earlier when he was still figuring out what he wanted to make. The characters of Peter and Brian Griffin grew directly out of 2 films called The Life of Larry, which MacFarlane made as his thesis project at the Rhode Island School of Design in 1995, and a follow-up called Larry and Steve, which aired as part of Cartoon Network's programming in 1997. Larry was a heavy-set, not particularly bright man. Steve was his talking dog. They were the raw material, the prototypes, the rough first drafts of something that would eventually become considerably more elaborate. MacFarlane took those 2 characters and built an entire family around them. He renamed them, refined them, gave them a fictional town called Quahog, Rhode Island, a house on Spooner Street, a neighborhood, a local bar, a school, a brewery, a supporting cast of neighbors and co-workers and friends. He drew on every sitcom he had grown up watching, the blue-collar family comedy of All in the Family, the ensemble warmth of The Simpsons, which had proven that animated family comedies could be serious cultural forces, the specific texture of American suburban life that shows, like these had spent decades mapping. He fed all of that through his own particular sensibility, which was darker than most, more willing to go somewhere unexpected, more interested in the gap between what people say they are and what they actually do. The show premiered on January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33. That is the single most valuable television slot that exists in American broadcasting. Tens of millions of people are already sitting on their couches with snacks in hand, in that comfortable post-game haze where the bar for entertainment is low and the willingness to try something new is high. Before they can change the channel or drift off to sleep, there is this strange new cartoon about a fat man who works at a toy factory, his long-suffering wife who plays the piano and somehow manages to hold the whole household together, their awkward teenage daughter who just wants to fit in, their clueless son who means well and understands almost nothing, a baby who speaks like a Bond villain and is currently plotting world domination, and a talking dog who considers himself a writer of some significance and drinks martinis. The first episode, Death Has a Shadow, pulled in around 22 million viewers. That is not a typo, that is an extraordinary number. Now, to be fair, the Super Bowl bump inflates that initial figure. Any show airing in that slot inherits a massive audience simply by being where it is in the schedule. But Family Guy held on. It did not evaporate the way some post-Super Bowl debuts do, vanishing the moment they had to survive on their own. People who watched that first episode came back the next week. They told their friends about the weird baby with the laser gun and the British accent. They described the cutaway where Peter compared his situation to something completely unrelated, and the show snapped to a brief, absurd visual gag before snapping back. They passed the word. By the end of the first season, Family Guy was ranked 33rd overall in the Nielsen ratings, averaging 12.8 million households. For a brand new animated comedy that almost no one had heard of 6 months before it aired, that was genuinely impressive. What made it work was the specificity of the characters, and it is worth spending some time here because the specificity is precisely what would later erode, and understanding what was there originally makes the loss of it more legible. Peter Griffin was not simply a dumb, fat man in the way that a character description might suggest. He was a specific kind of dumb, in a specific kind of body, in a specific kind of life. He was a working-class dad who loved beer, who had grown up watching too much television, who was irrationally devoted to pop culture references from the 1970s and 1980s. He worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory before eventually landing at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. He went to the Drunken Clam with Joe Swanson and Quagmire and Cleveland Brown on a regular basis and laughed too hard at things that were not that funny. He made terrible decisions constantly and spectacularly, but he made them with a kind of earnest confidence that was impossible not to find charming on some level. He was not mean. He was not malicious. He was a good person who happened to be genuinely, comprehensively, and consistently wrong about almost everything, and the comedy came from that specific quality rather than from any cruelty that lived underneath it. Lois was the anchor. She was the person who kept the house from collapsing under the weight of Peter's continuous stream of bad ideas. She played the piano beautifully, which was a detail that said something specific about who she had been before Peter and who she still was underneath the daily chaos of managing this family. She came from money, from a wealthy family who had disapproved of Peter, and she had chosen this life deliberately, and you could feel that in the way she looked at her husband. There was exasperation, yes, always, but there was also something that read as genuine love, genuine attachment to this particular person in all his ridiculous impracticality, and that combination of exasperation and affection was one of the show's most consistently warm emotional notes. Brian was the most human character in the show, which is an interesting thing to say about a dog. He walked on two legs, he drank martinis, he drove a car. He had read extensively, or at least claimed to have read extensively, and he had opinions about literature and culture that he shared with the kind of slightly too much enthusiasm that suggests a person who is still figuring out who they are intellectually. He was Peter's best friend in a way that did not quite make sense on paper, but made complete sense on screen, because their dynamic was essentially the most ancient of all comedic pairings, the fool and the observer, the person who does things and the person who watches them happen and says something wry about it. Brian was the one who would look at whatever disaster Peter had walked himself into and comment on it with a dry, affectionate precision that was the show's closest thing to a reliable emotional center. And Brian had his own specific sadness that made him feel real in a way that cartoon characters often do not. He was a failed writer. He had been working on a novel for years and could not finish it. He drank a bit too much, not in a way that was played for laughs primarily, but in a way that suggested something self-medicating underneath the sophistication. He had feelings for Lois that he kept mostly buried, but that would surface sometimes in ways that were touching rather than predatory. The feelings of someone who had been too close to something for too long, and had arrived at the quiet conviction that things might have gone differently. All of these qualities made Brian feel like someone you could actually know. Someone whose specific combination of intelligence and failure and buried feeling was recognizable from your own life or the lives of people you cared about. Then there was Stewie, the baby. He was something that had never quite existed on television before and has not truly existed since, in the same form, with the same specific charge of menace and absurdity. In the original 3 seasons, Stewie Griffin was a 1-year-old child with a crisp, menacing British accent, an arsenal of sophisticated weaponry that he had constructed himself in his bedroom, and an all-consuming ambition to either take over the entire world or kill his mother, depending on which goal seemed more immediately achievable on any given day. The humor was built entirely on contrast. Here was this tiny being in a yellow shirt and a diaper, sitting in a high chair smeared with pureed carrots, calmly and precisely discussing his plans to enslave all of humanity, while Lois smiled at him and wiped his chin and cooed at him about what a good boy he was. The gap between what he looked like and what he was actually doing was the engine of every scene he appeared in. The crucial additional layer was that most of the adults around Stewie could not understand him. They heard him making sounds, incomprehensible baby sounds, and responded to him accordingly. The elaborate speeches about world domination landed on deaf ears, literally. Brian was one of the only characters who could actually understand what Stewie was saying and have real conversations with him, and that mutual comprehension was the beginning of the friendship that would become so central to the show in later years. But in those early seasons, the inability of the adults to understand Stewie added a layer of dramatic irony to every scene. The audience knew exactly what Stewie was planning. The people around him had no idea. That gap created a constant low hum of comic tension that made every scene with him feel electrically alive. The humor in those first 3 seasons was also different in a structural sense from what the show would later become. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand if you want to follow the story of the decline. Yes, Family Guy always had cutaway gags. That was part of its identity from the very first episode. A character would reference something, the screen would cut to a brief visual joke, the joke would land in a few seconds, and then the story would continue. But in those early seasons, the cutaways existed in proportion to everything else. They were a feature, not a structure. The main plots were actual plots, with beginnings and middles and endings, with stakes that were small but real, with character moments that revealed something and advanced something. The cutaways were the seasoning on top of a meal that was already substantial and satisfying. You could have watched those early episodes with every cutaway removed and still had a coherent, funny, worthwhile show. The cutaways made it better. They did not make it exist. McFarlane was everywhere in those early seasons. He voiced 4 of the main characters. He was hands-on with the writing. He was involved in animation decisions. He had a specific vision of what this show was and what it sounded like and how far it should and should not go. The original writing team he assembled included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker, among others. And these writers worked closely with McFarlane to establish the particular tone and rhythm that made those first 3 seasons feel so specifically themselves. There was a clear intelligence behind every episode, a consistent point of view, a sense that the people making the show had a genuine and considered relationship with the characters they were writing. The show also had something that is very easy to miss in the abstract, and that becomes obvious the moment you watch an episode from those early seasons back to back with one from much later. It had warmth. The Griffins were a disaster of a family by any objective measure. Peter was a bumbling idiot. Lois was perpetually exasperated. The kids were awkward and strange in their various ways. The dog was drinking too much and failing to finish his book. And yet beneath all of that dysfunction, there was a genuine current of affection running through the family. Episodes ended with Peter and Lois reconciling after whatever argument the episode had put them through. Peter would do something stupid and then realize, in his slow and clumsy way, that he had been wrong, and he would try to fix it. Not always successfully, not with any particular grace, but he would try. You could feel, watching those episodes, that Seth MacFarlane liked these people. He found them funny, yes, but he also found them worth caring about, and that made it possible for the audience to feel the same way. That warmth, that sense that the show had genuine feeling underneath the comedy, was not ornamental. It was structural. It was what made the jokes land with a particular weight because there was something at stake underneath them. When a show treats its characters with affection, the audience mirrors that affection, and when the characters are in trouble, the audience feels it. The comedy and the feeling reinforce each other. Take away the feeling and the comedy gets lighter, less resonant, more disposable. Take away both, and what you have is just noise. If you are settling in right now, wherever you happen to be in the world, drop a comment below with the time and the place. There is something genuinely comforting about knowing people from completely different corners of the earth are listening to the same story in the quiet of their own nights. And if you want to be here for the next one, subscribing costs nothing and helps more than you might expect. Now back to Quahog. Section 2. The Cancellation, the Cult, and the Comeback. Here is something that almost never happens in the history of television. A show gets canceled, then it gets canceled again. And then, because enough people loved it deeply enough and refused to let go of it, it comes back from the dead and becomes bigger than it ever was the first time around. That is the story of what happened to Family Guy between 1999 and 2005. And understanding it fully is essential to understanding why the show's subsequent success contained within it the seeds of everything that would eventually go wrong. After that extraordinary Super Bowl debut and a first season that held its audience well enough to demonstrate real staying power, something began to go badly wrong. Not with the show itself. The writing was still good. The characters were still sharp. MacFarlane and his team were still producing episodes that crackled with the specific energy that had made people fall in love with them. What went wrong was entirely external, and it was entirely the fault of the network that was supposed to be nurturing the show rather than undermining it. The problem was Fox's scheduling decisions, which constituted one of the more spectacular examples of a network sabotaging its own product through apparent indifference. During Family Guy's second season, which launched in September of 1999, Fox moved the show from its comfortable Sunday night position to Thursday nights at 9 p.m. On the surface, Thursday night has prestige. It has history. Thursday nights in the late 1990s and early 2000s were competitive in a way that networks sometimes confused with desirable. The problem was that the 9 p.m. Thursday slot put Family Guy in direct competition with Frasier on NBC. And Frasier, at that precise moment in television history, was one of the most popular and critically acclaimed comedies on the air. It had been running for years. It had won multiple Emmy Awards. It had a devoted, established audience that was not going to abandon it for an unproven animated show from a first-time creator. Putting Family Guy up against Frasier was the kind of scheduling decision that, in retrospect, raises serious questions about whether anyone at Fox was actually paying attention to what they owned. The ratings dropped sharply and predictably. Fox's response was not to find the show a more sensible and hospitable time slot. Their response was to move it again. They pulled it off Thursday and put it on Tuesday nights, where it ran into a completely different problem. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on a BC? This quiz show, hosted by Regis Philbin in its American incarnation, was in the late 1990s a genuine phenomenon, the kind of cultural event that pulled enormous numbers week after week and dominated its time slot the way few shows in television history have managed to do. Family Guy could not compete with it either, and so the pattern continued. Fox would try a time slot, the ratings would suffer for reasons having everything to do with the competition and nothing to do with quality, and then Fox would move the show again, never giving the audience enough time to establish a viewing habit before the show disappeared from wherever it had been and reappeared somewhere else. The cumulative effect of this constant disruption was predictable. Audiences cannot find a show they cannot keep track of. They cannot build a viewing routine around a program that airs at different times on different nights with little advance notice. The audience that had shown up for that Super Bowl debut and come back through the first season was not gone. They still liked the show, they just kept losing track of where it was. And the ratings that resulted from this confusion were interpreted by Fox not as the consequence of their own mismanagement, but as evidence that the show was not pulling its weight. In 2002, after 3 seasons, Fox canceled Family Guy for the second and final time. The writing staff scattered. MacFarlane moved on. The show disappeared. But something was already happening in the years between 2002 and 2003 that no one at Fox had quite registered yet. The people who loved Family Guy were not letting go of it. They were trading copies. They were talking about specific episodes with the kind of detail and enthusiasm that you only bring to something you have watched multiple times. They were the beginning of what we would now recognize as a fandom, an organized collective investment in a piece of culture that refused to accept the official verdict that it was over. In 2003, 2 things happened simultaneously that would change television history. Cartoon Network acquired the rights to broadcast reruns of Family Guy on their Adult Swim late-night programming block. The price they paid for those rights was reportedly almost nothing. The president of 20th Century Fox Television later described it as getting the rights basically for free because at the time, with the show canceled and gone, nobody thought it was worth much. The DVDs for the first and second seasons were also released in 2003, timed to coincide with the Adult Swim premiere, and the combination of the 2 launches created something unexpected and explosive. Family Guy premiered on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003. Within weeks, it was the highest-rated show on the entire block. It was not just performing well by cable standards, it was dominating late-night viewing in its time slot against both cable and broadcast competition. Adult Swim's overall viewership jumped by 239%. That is not a typo. A show that Fox had canceled because of inadequate ratings was now airing as a rerun in the middle of the night on a cable channel aimed at young adults, pulling more viewers than almost anything else on television at that hour. And the DVD set sold 400,000 copies within the first month of release, eventually reaching 2.2 million copies, making them the best-selling television DVD of 2003 and second only in the all-time television DVD rankings to the first season of Chappelle's Show on Comedy Central. What was happening was something the television industry genuinely had not encountered in this form before. The show that Fox had canceled was proving, in real time and in real dollars, that it had an enormous audience that had simply never been given the chance to find it under stable conditions. People were not just watching the reruns. They were buying the physical media and keeping it. They were gifting DVDs to people who had never seen the show. They were building a cultural moment around something that had been declared dead and gone. A cult following had been quietly growing through the years since the cancellation, sustained by memory and tapes and conversations, and the Adult Swim platform gave that following both a gathering place and a way to grow. Fox, which had obtained those post-cancellation rerun rights for essentially nothing, started paying very close attention to what those numbers were saying. In May of 2004, Fox ordered 35 new episodes of Family Guy. The show was coming back. This was, at the time, genuinely unprecedented. Family Guy became the first television series ever to be revived from cancellation, based primarily on the strength of rerun ratings and home video sales. It had not just survived, it had written a new chapter in how television worked. Season 4 premiered on May 1st, 2005, to around 11.85 million viewers. Fans who had spent 3 years waiting for new episodes showed up in numbers that justified the revival entirely. Fox placed the show back in the middle of their animation domination Sunday night lineup, alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a new McFarlane show called American Dad that had premiered in February of 2005. The excitement was real. The goodwill was enormous. The numbers were excellent. Everything on the surface looked like the triumphant return of something that people had missed and were thrilled to have back. But here is where the first invisible crack appears, the one that is only visible in retrospect, but that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. The show that came back was not exactly the same show that had left. It could not be. 3 years is not nothing when you are talking about a television writing staff. Writers do not stay together through a cancellation. They find other work. They write for other shows. They develop their own projects. They grow in directions shaped by the rooms they ended up in after Family Guy closed its doors, and those directions are not always back toward whatever Family Guy had originally been. When the show returned in 2005, McFarlane himself acknowledged that one of the ongoing costs of the show's tumultuous history was having to constantly restaff the writing room. Each disruption broke up the team that had built the show's particular sensibility. Each revival required reassembling something that could not be perfectly reassembled. The animation had also changed, and this matters more than it might initially seem. The original 3 seasons had a slightly rougher, more handmade quality. The characters moved in a way that felt loose and a little unpredictable, as though the animators were still discovering what these people looked like when they were in motion. Rough Draft Studios, which handled seasons 2 and 3, gave the show a lively, expressive energy that fans remembered with particular affection. The season 4 animation was technically cleaner and more polished, but it was also stiffer. The outlines were heavier. The movements were more restricted. It looked more like a product and less like something people had poured themselves into. In animation, the line between technical improvement and loss of soul is finer than people outside the industry generally appreciate. The return gave the show life. New numbers. A new audience of people who had discovered Family Guy through Adult Swim and DVDs and were now encountering brand new episodes for the first time. All of that was real and valuable, but the return also changed the show's relationship to itself. It was no longer a scrappy underdog making its way through hostile network scheduling. It was a certified phenomenon, the most dramatic television comeback anyone had seen, and it was now expected to deliver reliably and repeatedly to a massive audience with very specific ideas about what Family Guy was supposed to be. Those expectations, paradoxically, would come to constrain the show in ways that the low-stakes creative freedom of those original 3 seasons had never done. Success, it turned out, was its own kind of prison. Section 3, The Shift Begins. What changed in seasons 4 and 5? When you watch season 4 of Family Guy now, knowing everything that would eventually happen to the show, there is something almost eerie about the viewing experience. You can see it beginning. Not in every episode, not in every scene, and not in any single catastrophically wrong decision. You can see it in small shifts, in the way certain things have moved slightly from where they were, in choices that feel inconsequential in isolation, but that, stacked against each other over months and seasons and years, will eventually add up to something much larger and much harder to reverse than any of them appeared to be individually. The most visible change, the one that would eventually become the most discussed symptom of the show's creative decline, was what happened to the cutaway gags. In the original 3 seasons, as described earlier, cutaways were a feature of Family Guy in the way that a distinctive chord structure might be a feature of a particular band's music. You recognized them, you associated them with the show, but they existed in proportion to everything else that was happening, serving the story rather than replacing it. The main plots were built with genuine dramatic architecture. They had moments of tension and release. They had character beats that moved the story forward. The cutaways added flavor, but were not the meal. Starting in season 4, the proportion began to shift. The cutaways got longer, taking up more of each episode's runtime. They got more frequent, appearing more often per scene than they had in the early years. And, most importantly, the stories started getting thinner, as though the writers had accepted, somewhere below the level of conscious decision, that the cutaways could carry the weight that stronger plots used to carry. An episode that in season 2 would have been built around a solid central story with cutaway embellishments was starting to look, in season 4, like a loose structure built primarily to connect cutaways to each other. The story was becoming scaffolding. The cutaways were becoming the building. Part of this shift was driven by a completely external cultural force that the show had no control over. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned from cancellation, and almost immediately it became apparent that Family Guy's cutaway format was perfectly suited to the viral clip culture that YouTube was creating. A self-contained 30-second gag that required no context, no knowledge of the larger episode, no understanding of anything beyond the 5 seconds of setup that preceded it, could be uploaded and shared and watched by millions of people who might never see the complete episode it came from. The show became one of the most viral programs on early internet video platforms, precisely because its humor was modular. You did not need to have watched anything else to understand why a particular cutaway was funny. Each one was its own complete comedic unit. This was commercially powerful in ways that the network and the studio were paying close attention to. Family Guy's clips were driving traffic, generating views, creating awareness for the show among audiences who would not have found it through conventional broadcast viewing. The cutaway format was not just a stylistic choice anymore. It was a distribution mechanism, and the writers, consciously or not, began making choices that served the distribution mechanism. Why spend several minutes on a character moment that built slowly and required investment? That moment would never be clipped. It would never go viral. Better to spend those minutes on 2 or 3 more quick gags that could each independently find an audience online. The logic was commercially sound and creatively corrosive. The characters themselves were beginning to shift during these seasons, and tracing the specific nature of those early shifts is important, because they explain how the later, more extreme changes were possible. Peter was still mostly lovable. He was still the bumbling dad whose stupidity came from not thinking things through rather than from any malice. But his intelligence was being pushed lower. The things he failed to understand were becoming more fundamental. The gaps in his reasoning were becoming wider. The line between Peter being a lovable fool and Peter being a character who seemed incapable of basic adult functioning was still intact in season 4, but it was under pressure. You could feel the writers testing how far they could push it. Brian's political views, which had always been part of the texture of who he was, were beginning to occupy more of the space of his character. In the early seasons, those views were one ingredient among many. He was a writer, he was a drinker, he was Peter's best friend. He was unlucky in love. He had a specific kind of intellectual aspiration that outpaced his actual achievement, and that gap was one of the most interesting and humanizing things about him. In Season 4, the political ingredient started expanding. There were scenes whose apparent primary purpose was Brian expressing a political position. Scenes where you could feel the show's own opinions breaking through the character's voice in a way that felt less like characterization and more like editorializing. Stewie's transformation was already underway by the end of Season 4, and it is worth examining in some detail because it represents one of the most consequential creative decisions the show would ever make. The original evil genius character, with his British accent and his ray guns and his elaborate schemes against Lois and the rest of humanity, was beginning to give way to something softer and more emotionally accessible. The world domination plots were becoming less frequent. The attempts on Lois's life were slowing down. Stewie was starting to show more of his interior emotional life, more vulnerability, more warmth, particularly in his developing friendship with Brian. Some of this worked beautifully. The road to episodes, the special adventure installments where Brian and Stewie would go on some improbable journey together, were often the highlights of their respective seasons and demonstrated genuine chemistry between the characters. The humor in these episodes came from the specific dynamic between a baby who spoke like a British villain and a dog who aspired to literary seriousness. And the way that dynamic produced unexpected warmth under pressure was genuinely original and satisfying. There are road to episodes from this era that hold up as some of the finest things the show ever produced. But the trade-off was real. The writers were choosing accessibility over singularity. The softer Stewie was easier to write for, easier to put in a variety of situations, easier to use as a vehicle for the kind of emotional storytelling that gets positive critical reception. The evil Stewie, the original one, was harder. He had specific constraints. He had a specific premise that required commitment. He was dangerous in a way that required the show to hold certain things steady, certain rules about what his presence meant and what it could produce. The new Stewie was more flexible, more available, more easily deployed in whatever direction a given episode needed. The cost was that he was also less irreplaceable. Season 5, which ran from 2006 to 2007, produced episodes that stand as genuine arguments for the show's continued quality during this period. Stewie Loves Lois inverted the fundamental Stewie and Lois relationship in ways that were surprising and earned. Road to Rupert showcased the Brian and Stewie dynamic at its most charming and well-observed. Barely Legal, in which Meg develops a complicated attachment to Brian after he takes her to prom out of compassion, was character-driven comedy of real quality, the kind that required the writers to understand who Meg and Brian were as people rather than as vehicles for gags. These episodes proved that the capacity for excellent work had not disappeared. The talent was still there. But Season 5 also escalated the treatment of Meg in ways that would have lasting consequences. The jokes were shifting from Meg being boring and invisible to Meg being actively ugly and deserving of contempt. And the writers were discovering, in the way television writers sometimes discover things they probably should not, that this escalation got a reliable audience response. The laughs were there. So they kept going, a little further each time, without pausing to ask whether what they were building had any relationship to comedy, or whether it was something else dressed in comedy's clothes. The family dynamics in general were also beginning to cool from what they had been in the early seasons. Peter and Lois fought differently now, with less of the playful exasperation that characterized their early conflicts, and more of something that felt genuinely cold. The moments of reconciliation that had closed out early episodes, the small affirmations of love and family that had given the show its warmth, were becoming less frequent. The Griffins were starting to seem less like a family that loved each other, despite their dysfunction, and more like a family that happened to live in the same house, and mostly found each other exhausting. This was a gradual change, the kind you might not notice from week to week. But if you watched a first season episode and then jumped directly to a fifth season episode, you would feel the temperature difference immediately. Section 4. The Flanderization of Peter Griffin. There is a concept that has become essential vocabulary in conversations about long-running television. And Family Guy did not invent it, but arguably perfected it into something almost clinical in its extremity. Flanderization. The term comes from Ned Flanders on The Simpsons. In the early years of that show, Ned was a fully realized human being who happened to be religious and good-natured and patient with his impossible neighbor Homer. His faith was one piece of who he was, integrated into a complete personality that also included being a devoted father, a patient friend, and a genuinely kind person whose goodness was real rather than performed. Over many seasons, the writers stripped away everything else about Ned until only the religiosity remained, until Ned was no longer a person who happened to be religious, but rather a walking, talking embodiment of a single trait. Flanderization is what happens when a character's most prominent quality expands to consume everything else about them, until they are no longer a person, but a caricature of a single characteristic. Family Guy is, in most people's informed estimation, the most extreme example of this process in the history of American animated television. Every major character in the show underwent some version of it, but no character underwent it more completely, more visibly, and with more damaging consequences for the show as a whole than Peter Griffin. Let us be precise about what Peter was in the beginning, because precision matters here. In the original 3 seasons, Peter was stupid. That is not a complicated observation. He was demonstrably not intelligent. He misunderstood things. He missed obvious implications. He took advice literally that was meant figuratively. He made decisions on the basis of whatever impulse was most immediate rather than whatever reasoning was most sound. All of this was true and present from the very first episode. But Peter's stupidity in those seasons had a specific quality that made it comedy rather than tragedy. It was paired with warmth. Peter was dumb, but he meant well. He loved his family in a way that was genuine, even when the expression of that love was completely misguided. When he messed things up, which he did constantly, he felt it. He experienced something recognizable as guilt. He apologized in his clumsy and imperfect way. He tried to make things right, the cycle of screwing up, feeling bad about screwing up, and trying to fix what had been broken was the engine of the early Peter episodes, and that cycle worked because all 3 parts of it were real. The screwing up was real, the feeling bad was real, and the trying to fix it was real. That cycle required Peter to be capable of something like genuine moral response. It required him to have actual feelings about the people he loved and actual distress when he hurt them. That is a character who has emotional depth, even if that depth is not particularly sophisticated. And that depth is exactly what began to erode from Season 4 onward, and what was largely gone by Season 8. The intelligence collapse was the first visible sign. Starting around Season 4 and accelerating through Seasons 5, 6, and 7, Peter's stupidity was pushed steadily lower, past the point where it was funny dumb and into the range where it started to be alarming dumb, then deeply unsettling dumb, then something that raised genuine questions about how this character could function in any society at all. In the early seasons, Peter was dumb in a specific and human way. He did not think things through. He acted on impulse. He misread social situations. These are things real people do, exaggerated for comedic effect. By the later seasons, Peter was dumb in a way that suggested he might be medically incapable of caring for himself, let alone holding a job, maintaining friendships, and raising 3 children. But the intelligence collapse, as damaging as it was to the character's credibility, was secondary to the cruelty shift. Because what really transformed Peter from a beloved comedic creation into something that made audiences genuinely uncomfortable was not that he got stupider, it was that he got mean. The early Peter, the one who felt bad when he hurt people and tried to do better, was replaced by a Peter who did not seem to register that he was hurting people at all, or who registered it and did not care, or who occasionally seemed to find some active satisfaction in the harm he caused. The examples from the later seasons are not subtle and not exceptional. They are representative. In an episode called Baby It's Cold Inside, Peter and Lois are on a boat when Peter sees what he believes is a shark fin in the water. Without any hesitation, without a single moment of internal conflict, he grabs Lois, shoves her beneath the surface of the water, and uses her body as a barrier between himself and the perceived threat while he escapes. He does not try to help her. He does not cry out in panic and accidentally knock her in while trying to do something heroic but stupid. He deliberately uses his wife as a shield against what he believes is a lethal threat. He leaves her there and runs. The fin turns out to be a dolphin, but that is genuinely beside the point. The point is what Peter chose to do without any internal resistance at all. The early Peter would not have made that choice. Not because he was braver, but because he loved Lois in a way that would have made putting her in danger for his own survival psychologically impossible. The later Peter does not love anyone in a way that operates as a constraint on self-preservation. There is an episode in which Peter steals Stewie's Halloween candy, not takes a piece or two while trick-or-treating, steals the entire collection from a baby, his own baby. And the episode includes an almost casual mention that Peter used to steal Chris's Halloween candy when Chris was small too. This is presented as a punchline, a piece of character texture, an example of Peter's lovably irresponsible approach to fatherhood. But when you look at it plainly, it is a father who has habitually deprived his children of things they were excited about, not through carelessness, but through deliberate, repeated, self-interested taking. That is not a lovable trait. That is a pattern of behavior that describes something about who a person actually is at their core. In Internal Affairs, Peter nearly destroys the marriage of his best friend Joe by convincing Joe to cheat on his wife Bonnie. Joe is one of Peter's closest friends. The early Peter gave people bad advice because he was too dumb to know it was bad advice. That is understandable and forgivable and even charming. The later Peter appears to be steering his friend actively toward infidelity with something that reads less like misguided helpfulness and more like malice, or at least profound indifference to what happens to the people around him. The most devastating accounting of what Peter had become was delivered not by a critic from the outside, but by Meg, from the inside of the show itself, in the Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party. In this episode, Meg confronts her family during a hurricane that has trapped them all in the house. She turns to Peter and says, with a precision that is clearly the work of writers who understood exactly what they had been doing to this character for years, everything that is wrong with him. She calls him completely selfish. She calls him totally irresponsible as a father. She notes that he has no education and no meaningful interests, and that he simply does whatever impulsive thing presents itself to him without considering the consequences to anyone around him. She tells him that he terrorizes the community with his behavior. She tells him he physically abuses his own daughter for entertainment. She tells him that if anyone outside the family could see how he treats his children, he would be in legal trouble. And every single thing Meg says is true. It is not exaggeration. It is not dramatic license. It is a precise, accurate, evidence-based summary of things Peter has actually done on screen, documented across many seasons of episodes that the audience has actually watched. The show itself is the evidence for the prosecution. And Peter's response to this complete and accurate indictment is to laugh. He finds it amusing. His daughter is describing the sum total of his failures as a parent and a human being, and his reaction is entertainment. The early Peter would have felt something recognizable as shame or hurt or self-recognition, even if he immediately tried to deflect it. The later Peter feels nothing that resembles those things. He has been rewritten past the point where those responses are available to him. Peter's friendships followed the same downward trajectory. In the early seasons, Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland were a genuine group of friends who cared about each other in the rough and imperfect way that adult male friendships often operate. They watched out for each other. They showed up for each other in the ways that mattered. Their friendship was one of the most consistently warm elements of the show, a reliable counterweight to the chaos of the domestic plots. As the seasons accumulated, those friendships became progressively more hollow and toxic. Peter did increasingly harmful things to his friends with progressively less consequence and progressively less apparent feeling. The Drunken Clam went from being a gathering place of genuine companionship to being a setting in which four men happened to occupy the same space while being casually awful to one another. The show's treatment of Joe Swanson is illustrative. When Joe was introduced in Season 1 in an episode called A Hero Sits Next Door, he was the admired new neighbor, the accomplished, respected cop in the wheelchair that Peter was genuinely jealous of because of how much admiration Joe commanded. Over many seasons, Joe went from being the person everyone looked up to being the person everyone made fun of. His disability, which in the early episodes was handled with something approaching thoughtfulness, became a reliable punchline. His marriage deteriorated. His friends mocked him rather than supporting him. Peter, who had once been jealous of Joe's excellence, became someone who consistently used Joe as a target. The trajectory of Joe's treatment mirrors the trajectory of Peter's character in miniature, from something warm and complicated to something that treats human pain as a resource. Section 5. Brian Griffin, The Fall of the Voice of Reason. If Peter Griffin's decline is the story of a character being slowly rewritten into something unrecognizable, then Brian Griffin's decline is the story of a character whose fall is more painful precisely because of how high he started. Brian was the show's emotional center in a way that no other character was. He was the anchor, the perspective through which the audience was implicitly invited to process everything insane happening around him. He was the person in the room who noticed what was wrong, who named it, who looked at the chaos of the Griffin household, and of Quahog at large and said something dry and honest and correct about it. He was the character most like the audience, and losing him to his own worst tendencies was among the most significant things the show ever did to itself. In the original 3 seasons, Brian was the most human character in Family Guy. This is objectively an interesting statement to make about a dog, but it was also objectively true in the way the show operated. MacFarlane voices Brian using his own natural speaking voice, without any of the character affectations he applies to Peter or Stewie or Quagmire. Brian sounded like Seth MacFarlane talking, which gave him an immediacy and intimacy that the other characters did not quite have in the same way. He was the one who was closest to the surface of things, the least filtered, the most directly himself. He was also genuinely intelligent, and this is important to be specific about because it contrasts with what he later became. In the early seasons, Brian had read the books he talked about. He had actual taste that expressed itself in specific, knowledgeable preferences rather than in vague gestures towards sophistication. His dry humor required real wit to produce, the kind of wit that sees the gap between what something is and what it presents itself as and can articulate that gap in a single phrase that lands. He was perceptive about people, capable of understanding motivations and patterns that other characters missed. He was not always right, and his blind spots were also real and humanizing, but his intelligence was genuine rather than performed. Brian also had what is perhaps the most important quality for a character who is supposed to be the voice of reason in a room full of chaos. He was honest about his own flaws. He knew he drank too much. He knew his novel was not finished and suspected, at some level, that it might not be worth finishing. He knew that his feelings for Lois were something he needed to keep contained rather than acting on. He knew he was not quite as accomplished as he sometimes presented himself as being. These private honesties gave him depth, made him feel like someone genuinely reckoning with who he was rather than simply declaring himself to be something. You could root for Brian because he was trying, imperfectly and sometimes self-defeatingly, to be the person he wanted to be. The first significant shift came after the 2005 revival, as it did with most things in Family Guy's history. Brian's political views, which had been one texture among many in his early characterization, began to expand. In the early seasons, Brian was liberal, openly atheist, aware of, and opinionated about social and political issues. But these qualities sat alongside everything else he was. They were not his primary mode of engagement with the world. Starting in Season 4 and accelerating through Seasons 5 and 6, the political content of Brian's scenes increased. There were sequences that seemed to have no purpose beyond deploying Brian as a vehicle for expressing a particular position on a particular issue. The audience watching these scenes could tell because the scenes felt different from the scenes where Brian was being Brian, rather than where Brian was being the writer's editorial voice. Even viewers who agreed with every position Brian was expressing found these moments annoying because they felt like the show had stopped trusting its own character and started using him as a conduit. But the political soapboxing was the more forgivable problem. What happened to Brian beneath the politics was more serious. The genuine intelligence began to hollow out. The self-awareness disappeared. The honesty about his own failings, which had made him sympathetic and real, was replaced by something much less attractive, an arrogance that had no performance behind it. Brian talked about being a great writer and an intellectual, but the show stopped providing any evidence that these claims were grounded in anything. He claimed sophistication without demonstrating it. He claimed moral superiority while behaving worse than most of the characters he criticized. He became, in the most precise possible sense, a fraud. The Season 9 episode Brian Writes a Bestseller is the moment that most viewers who track the character's decline identify as the point of no return. Stewie, who genuinely believed in Brian and wanted him to succeed, encouraged Brian to get back to writing after years of creative paralysis. Brian, taking that encouragement seriously, wrote a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It. That became an immediate commercial phenomenon. This could have been a genuinely warm episode. It could have been about what it feels like when someone who believed in you gets to watch you succeed, about the grace required to accept that belief without letting success corrupt it. Instead, the moment Brian's book became successful, he turned on Stewie with a contempt and cruelty that was startling in its completeness. He treated the person who had given him the belief to try again as though that person was beneath him. He was monstrous, and the show presented his monstrousness without any effective counterweight. From that point, the accumulation of terrible Brian behavior in the later seasons was persistent and sometimes genuinely shocking. In one episode, he finds a woman trapped in a car that is teetering at the edge of water, about to fall in. He begins to pull her to safety. Then he discovers she has a child, which means she is almost certainly married. He releases her and lets the car fall. He allows an innocent woman and her child to drown because she was not available for him to pursue romantically. This is not dark comedy in any form that the term conventionally describes. Dark comedy requires the darkness to be in service of something, to reveal something, to make a point that justifies the discomfort. This scene makes no such point. It depicts a character choosing to let two people die for a petty reason, and the only context the show provides is comedic framing that cannot bear the weight it is being asked to carry. The Quagmire speech in Jerome is the New Black from Season 8 is one of the most famous scenes in the show's post-revival history, and its fame is instructive. In the scene, Quagmire delivers a sustained and comprehensive accounting of everything wrong with Brian, calling out his hypocrisy, his pretension, his treatment of Lois, his failures as a father, his fundamental dishonesty about who and what he is. The speech is precise and correct and clearly written by people who understood exactly what Brian had become. And the scene was immediately celebrated by fans who had been feeling exactly what Quagmire was saying for years. It was cathartic. It was an acknowledgement. The show was looking at its own character with clear eyes and seeing what was there. What the show did with that acknowledgement is what made it ultimately more damaging than helpful. It used the speech as a release valve without following through on the pressure it was acknowledging. Brian heard everything Quagmire said. He understood it. The audience watched him receive it. And then, in the episodes that followed, he continued behaving exactly as he had been behaving before the speech, as if it had made no impression at all. The show demonstrated self-awareness and then immediately demonstrated that the self-awareness had no consequences, which is, in a way, the most dishonest form of self-awareness possible. The death of Brian in Season 12's Life of Brian was the clearest possible illustration of where the show's relationship with its characters had arrived by that point. Brian was hit by a car and died on the operating table. The Griffin family mourned him. Stewie was inconsolable. A replacement dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, was introduced. 25,000 fans signed a petition. The death trended nationally. The show had never generated more attention and conversation in years. And then, just 2 episodes later, in Christmas Guy, Stewie used a time machine to go back to the moment before the accident and save Brian's life. Everything was undone. The death that had been presented as real and permanent and emotionally significant was revealed to have been a stunt. McFarlane himself stated afterward that the team was surprised by how angry fans got. He said they had expected it to create a stir, but had not anticipated the rage. What the episode demonstrated was not cruelty toward the audience exactly, but something more revealing. A complete disconnection between the show and the reality of what its characters meant to the people watching. The writers treated Brian's death as a ratings maneuver, a tool for generating temporary buzz because that is how they had come to think of the characters, as instruments rather than people. The audience, which had been watching for years and had formed real attachments to these specific individuals, experienced the death as a real loss and the quick reversal as a betrayal. Neither the death nor the reversal served the story because the story was no longer the point. Section 6. The Stewie Problem. Losing the Evil Genius. Every great television show has that one character who makes it singular. The character people reference in conversation with people who have never seen a single episode. The character who becomes a costume, a meme, a reference point in the culture beyond the show that produced them. For the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, before it or anything else, that character was Stewie Griffin. And the story of what happened to Stewie is the story of one of the most consequential creative decisions the show ever made. A decision made for understandable reasons that nonetheless removed from the air something that had never existed before and has not existed since. To understand what made original Stewie work, you have to understand the completeness of his commitment. He was not a baby who occasionally had dark thoughts. He was not a precocious child who said surprising things. He was a fully realized criminal intelligence housed in a baby's body, with an accent, a vocabulary, a strategic mind, and a set of ambitions that encompassed planetary domination as a reasonable near-term goal. His weapons were real. His plans were detailed and technically considered. His hatred of Lois was specific and sustained. When he referred to enslaving humanity or destroying his mother, it was not hyperbole. It was his actual agenda for the day. The comedy, as noted earlier, came from contrast, from the gap between the image and the reality, from the fact that this creature of menace and ambition was housed in a body that required diaper changes, that had to be carried by the person it was plotting to destroy, that could not reach the kitchen counter without a step stool. That contrast was the engine of the character, and what made it inexhaustible in those early seasons was the writer's commitment to it. They played it completely straight. Stewie was never winking at the camera. He was never acknowledging that his situation was inherently absurd. He was absolutely serious about his plans, which made everything about him funnier than if he had been self-aware. The decision to phase out the evil genius persona came from McFarlane and the writing staff who felt, as creative teams sometimes do, that a premise has reached the end of what it can produce. They had done the evil baby thing for 3 seasons. They had covered a lot of the obvious territory. They believed that continuing to mine the same material would make the character feel repetitive rather than fresh. They wanted to grow him in a different direction, one that allowed for emotional range and character development that the villain premise did not easily accommodate. This was a legitimate concern, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Creative stagnation is real. Characters that never change can become tiresome. The impulse to find new dimensions in an established personality is generally healthy and usually produces better television than the impulse to simply repeat what already worked. But the execution of this impulse, in Stewie's case, traded something irreplaceable for something merely good. The original Stewie was one of a kind. His specific combination of infant appearance and adult malevolence, of tiny physical form and enormous intellectual ambition, of absolute seriousness about a premise that was inherently ridiculous, created something that had no equivalent anywhere in the history of animated comedy. The show did not inherit this character. It created him. And the writers chose to retire him because they had run out of ideas for him, which is a very different thing from the character having exhausted his potential. Here is the evidence for that claim. Family Guy has now produced far more seasons with the softer, emotionally accessible version of Stewie than it ever did with the original evil genius. If 3 seasons was genuinely the limit of what the evil baby premise could produce, then surely the gentle, emotional growth premise should have run dry after 4 or 5 seasons. Instead, it has been running for more than 15. If the argument was truly about the premise being exhausted, the replacement premise should have exhausted itself long before now. The real argument, the more honest one, is that the replacement premise is easier to write. It puts Stewie in situations that require less specific commitment. It allows him to be deployed in a wider variety of episodes. It makes him more versatile at the cost of making him less singular. The Stewie and Brian friendship that replaced the evil genius framework produced some genuinely excellent work. The road to episodes are consistently among the best things the show made in its post-revival years. Episodes like the Season 8 Brian and Stewie, in which the two characters are locked in a bank vault overnight and simply talk to each other, honestly and vulnerably, about what they mean to each other and what they fear, is one of the finest pieces of television the show ever produced. None of that would have been possible with the original Stewie, who did not have the emotional accessibility required for that kind of intimacy. That is a real achievement, and it deserves acknowledgement. But it was purchased at a price. What the show gained in emotional range, it lost in electrical originality. The Stewie who appears in later seasons is charming. He is often funny. He has his moments of genuine brilliance. But he does not make the hair on the back of your neck stand up the way the original did. He does not create that specific quality of delighted alarm that came from watching a baby in a diaper calmly explain his plan for the permanent subjugation of the human race. That quality, once gone, could not be replaced. The show moved on and produced good work in different modes, but the singular, irreplaceable thing was gone. Section 7. Meg as a punching bag. The joke that went too far. There is a difference between a character who is treated poorly by other characters as a source of comedy, a setup that can work brilliantly when handled with intelligence and care, and a show that has decided a character simply deserves to suffer and has made that suffering its primary contribution to the narrative. The first is legitimate comedy. The second is something that looks like comedy from a distance, but that, upon examination, communicates something much more troubling about the values underlying it. Family Guy crossed from the first category into the second somewhere around season 4 or 5, and stayed there for approximately a decade. In the original 3 seasons, Meg Griffin was a character. She was not a particularly complex character by the standards of the ensemble, and this was by design. In a family that contained an evil genius baby, a talking philosopher dog, a reckless idiot patriarch, and a long-suffering but genuinely capable mother, the ordinary teenager was the odd one out, and her ordinariness was itself a kind of running joke. She was the unpopular one. She wanted to fit in and did not manage it. She was slightly less interesting than everyone else in the room, which was charming in its own way because it was so specifically relatable. Most people have felt like the least interesting person in their family at some point, and Meg gave that experience a face. Peter's treatment of Meg in those early seasons was careless rather than cruel. He said insensitive things without registering that they were insensitive. He forgot she was in the room sometimes. He paid more attention to his own needs and interests than to hers. These were the behaviors of a father who was not fully present, not a father who actively wished his daughter harm. And the rest of the family was similarly mild in their neglect. Lois paid attention to Meg, cared about her, tried to support her, even if her support was sometimes clumsy or missed the mark. The kids had normal sibling dynamics. The treatment of Meg in the early seasons reflected something real and recognizable about family dynamics without tipping into anything that required moral evaluation. The shift that began in season 4 was specific and definable. The jokes about Meg stopped being about her being boring and started being about her being ugly and deserving of contempt. This is not a subtle distinction. When your comedy about a character is about them being unremarkable, you are making a joke that is ultimately sympathetic. You are saying that this person is human and ordinary, and the humor is in the gap between ordinariness and the extraordinary context around them. When your comedy about a character is about them being physically repellent and fundamentally unwanted, you are making a very different kind of joke. You are saying that this person's existence is itself an affront, that there is something about them that justifies any treatment they receive, that the appropriate response to their presence is revulsion. The escalation was gradual and then suddenly not gradual at all. By seasons 8 through 14, the treatment of Meg had become one of the defining characteristics of the show. Peter was not just inattentive. He was actively abusive, farting in her face as entertainment, making comments about wishing she would go away, treating her with an open contempt that the show treated as comedy, but that, observed without the comedy framing, described a form of domestic abuse. There is an episode in which a flashback reveals that Peter and Lois tried to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was a baby, before she could walk or talk, simply because they decided they did not want her. This is presented as a punchline. The audience is invited to laugh at the image of a baby being left at a fire station by her parents. The comedy depends on accepting, implicitly, that there was something about this particular baby that made abandonment an understandable response. By that point in the show's run, the entire population of Quahog seemed to have reached an agreement that Meg Griffin deserved whatever was done to her. Characters who had never met her insulted her on sight. Teachers mistreated her. Random strangers expressed disgust at her presence. The world of the show had constructed a consensus around Meg's worthlessness that required the audience to share it in order to participate in the comedy. And many audiences did share it, or at least performed sharing it, which is one of the more uncomfortable aspects of the whole business. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode from Season 10 is the hinge on which everything turns. Meg confronts her family. She delivers a speech that is genuinely powerful and honest, that names specifically what each family member has done to her and what it has cost her. She stands up for herself with a force and clarity that feels, after seasons of watching her absorb abuse silently, like a long overdue release. Fans cheered. Critics noted it as a rare moment of the show, treating Meg as a real person with real feelings and real experiences. It seemed briefly like the show was preparing to change something fundamental about how it handled its most abused character, and then the episode ended by having Meg take it all back. By having her conclude that her role in the family is to be the one who absorbs the abuse, that without her serving as a lightning rod for everyone else's dysfunction, the family would turn on each other. She apologizes for standing up for herself. She returns to her position. The episode argued, explicitly and without apparent irony, that victims of sustained abuse should continue accepting that abuse because it serves an important psychological function for the people doing the abusing. The addition of more women to the writing staff in later seasons is widely credited with eventually changing how Meg was written. By season 15 and beyond, the extreme cruelty began to diminish. By season 22, it had largely stopped. Meg was given storylines where she was competent and interesting and worth caring about. Characters reconciled with her, she was treated, finally, like a person rather than a target. This was a genuine improvement. It is worth acknowledging. But it came after approximately a decade of something else, and the decade is what most people remember when they think about Meg Griffin. The final irony of Meg's story in Family Guy is this. She may actually be the most sympathetic and the most human character in the entire ensemble. A teenage girl who wants to be loved by her family, accepted by her peers, seen for what she actually is. These are among the most fundamental and universal desires in human experience. The show spent years treating those desires as punchlines. When it stopped doing that, even partially, the character that emerged was one of the most interesting in the show's later seasons. The capacity for something better was always there. The choice to do something worse was made anyway, for a long time because it got laughs. Section 8. Cutaway gags and the collapse of storytelling. In April of 2006, the animated comedy South Park aired a two-part episode called Cartoon Wars that became one of the most discussed pieces of television criticism ever produced by a fictional comedy series. The episode began as a response to a controversy involving Family Guy and depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, but its real purpose, which became apparent quickly, was something more pointed and more personal. A comprehensive critique of Family Guy's entire approach to comedy. In the episode, Cartman infiltrates the Family Guy production studio and discovers how the show generates its jokes. The writing staff turns out to be a colony of manatees living in a large tank. These manatees select ball-shaped objects from a pile, each one inscribed with a different word, a noun here, a verb there, a celebrity name, a pop culture reference. The manatees push the balls through a machine and the machine generates a cutaway gag. The implication is explicit and impossible to misread. Family Guy's comedy is not the product of skilled writers exercising intelligence and craft. It is the random assemblage of disconnected elements, interchangeable in any combination, requiring no actual thought to produce. The comedy is mechanical. It is noise. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who created South Park, stated openly that they found Family Guy's approach to humor lazy and fundamentally disrespectful to the craft of comedy writing. They believed that jokes disconnected from character and story were not really jokes at all, that they were just stimuli producing reflexive responses in audiences who had been conditioned to laugh at certain types of input regardless of whether the input was actually funny. McFarlane, to his credit, responded with some self-awareness. At a Harvard commencement address in 2006, speaking in character as Stewie, he acknowledged that the cutaways had nothing to do with the story and were simply there to be funny, as if that were a complete and sufficient justification. In a 2012 interview with Rolling Stone, he called the Cartoon Wars episode funny and accurate. Parker and Parker later said they received calls of gratitude from writers on both The Simpsons and King of the Hill after the episode aired, thanking them for making it. None of this acknowledgement changed what the show was actually doing. The cutaways kept proliferating, kept getting longer, kept occupying more of each episode's runtime. Because whatever McFarlane's assessment of their artistic value, they worked commercially. They generated viral clips. They drove traffic. They were the version of Family Guy that spread most easily through the culture. The acknowledgement of the problem was genuine, but the response was essentially nothing. The structural problem with cutaway dependency can be stated precisely. A show that tells stories builds on itself over time. Each episode develops the characters, adds to their history, deepens the audience's understanding of who they are and what they want, and how they respond to pressure. Characters become more real with each episode, and as they become more real, the audience's investment deepens, and as the investment deepens, subsequent stories carry more weight. It is a self-reinforcing cycle of development that compounds over time. Cutaway gags contribute nothing to this cycle. By definition, they are disconnected from character and story. They do not develop anyone. They do not reveal anything. They are complete in themselves and leave no trace. An episode built primarily around cutaways is an episode that, when it ends, has moved nothing forward, developed no one, revealed nothing new, and left the audience exactly where they were before it started, except with a few laughs and some clips they might share online. The story, such as it is identical at the episode's end to what it was at the episode's beginning. The characters have not changed. The relationships have not shifted. Nothing has been learned. The episode existed purely as a delivery mechanism for gags and has now been delivered and is over. When this is the structure of one episode, it is fine. Television does not require every episode to advance the larger story in a significant way. Not every episode of any show can be a landmark. But when this becomes the baseline structure of most episodes, something gets lost that cannot easily be recovered. The audience loses the habit of caring what happens. The writers lose the muscles required to build stories that actually go somewhere. The characters stop feeling like people in the middle of their lives and start feeling like props being moved through scenarios designed to maximize the number of gag opportunities per runtime minute. The Conway Twitty gag, which appeared in multiple episodes across several seasons, became the most infamous symbol of what this looked like in practice. Rather than a cutaway to a joke, the show would simply cut to unedited footage of the country singer Conway Twitty performing a full song. Not a parody, not a commentary on country music. The actual recording, playing in full for a minute or more while the audience waited for it to end. The joke, to the extent there was one, was the absence of a joke. The first time it aired, it was genuinely unexpected, and there was something in that unexpectedness that functioned as comedy. By the fourth and fifth time, it was understood broadly as one of the laziest things to have aired on a major network comedy in recent memory. It was the show saying to its audience, with a kind of studied indifference, "We do not have enough material to fill this episode. Enjoy this country singer in the meantime." And yet, Within all of this, there are individual episodes that demonstrate with absolute clarity what Family Guy could be when it chose to take storytelling seriously. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie is the most often cited example, and it deserves that citation. The entire episode takes place in a bank vault, overnight. Brian and Stewie are locked in. There is no way out. All they have is each other and the conversation that follows. There are no cutaways. There are no random gags. There is no plot beyond two people, one of whom is technically a dog and one of whom is technically a baby, talking honestly to each other about their lives. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in his safety deposit box because he has, at various points, seriously considered ending his own life. Stewie reveals the depth of his love for Brian, that Brian is the most important person in his world, that losing Brian would be something he could not bear. The episode is raw and funny and quietly devastating and completely unlike anything else the show produced in its later seasons. That episode exists. It is proof that the capacity for genuine storytelling was never lost. The writers who made it were clearly capable of making more things like it. They mostly chose not to. And the choice to fill time with cutaway gags instead of stories like that one is the choice that, accumulated across hundreds of episodes, defines what Family Guy eventually became. Section 9. Seth MacFarlane steps away. The creator leaves the creation. There is a creative principle that is so widely understood in the arts that it barely needs articulating, and yet it regularly fails to be applied in the commercial entertainment industry where the economics of production create enormous pressure to keep making things long after the person who made them originally has moved on. The principle is this. The creator of something embodies a specific intelligence about that thing that cannot be transferred to others. They know why the thing exists. They know what it is trying to do. They know where the line is between the version of it that works and the version that does not. And they can feel when that line is being crossed in ways that other people, however skilled and experienced, cannot replicate. Seth MacFarlane built Family Guy. He did not just produce it or oversee it or put his name on it. He built it. Starting from animated shorts he made himself in his own apartment on a $50,000 budget from Fox. He voiced the characters. He wrote the episodes. He understood, in a way that was stored not just in his professional knowledge but in his body memory, from years of creative involvement, why each character worked, and what would happen if those characters were pushed in directions that violated their essential natures. His presence in the room was a quality filter of a kind that is essentially impossible to replicate through institutional process. In September of 2017, MacFarlane confirmed during an AMA on Reddit what many fans had suspected for some time. He had stopped writing for Family Guy as far back as 2010. He continued voicing the characters, which meant he was still in the recording booth regularly, still giving voice to Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire. But the writing itself, the actual construction of the stories, and the jokes and the character decisions that made up each episode had been handed off to others years earlier. Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, both experienced and talented television professionals, took over the show-running responsibilities. They knew Family Guy. They had been around it for years and understood its world thoroughly. But there is a category of knowledge about a creative work that only its creator possesses. A kind of intuitive familiarity that is not the same as intellectual understanding and cannot be acquired through study or proximity. MacFarlane knew, without having to reason it through, why a particular joke went too far, why a character choice felt wrong, why the warmth that held the show together was beginning to drain away. He knew because he had built those things deliberately and could feel when they were being undone. Without his presence in the room making those calls, the show was free to drift in directions that, individually, seemed reasonable or at least defensible, but that cumulatively moved it further and further from what it had originally been. MacFarlane's departure from active writing coincided with a period of extraordinary expansion in his career. The 2012 film Ted, which he wrote, directed, produced, and starred in, earned over $500 million worldwide and established him as a bankable live-action filmmaker, as well as an animation powerhouse. A Million Ways to Die in the West followed in 2014, Ted 2 in 2015. The science fiction series The Orville premiered in 2017, first on Fox and then on Hulu. He recorded multiple albums of big band and jazz standards that received genuine critical notice. He hosted the Academy Awards in 2013. He was unambiguously one of the most in-demand and prolific creative figures in American entertainment. Family Guy was one item on a list that had become very long. The tension between MacFarlane and Fox became increasingly visible during this period and is worth understanding as part of the show's story. MacFarlane is politically liberal, openly and without ambivalence, and his relationship with Fox as a broadcast network was complicated by Fox's close association with Fox News, which MacFarlane found politically uncomfortable. In 2021, he posted on social media that Fox News host Tucker Carlson's commentary made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. He used the phrase that the relationship resembled a failing marriage, which is a fairly precise description of two parties who know the arrangement is not working, but have not yet found the mechanism to end it. In 2020, MacFarlane signed a reported $200 million deal with NBC Universal over 5 years, moving his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, and his newer projects entirely away from Fox. The Orville moved to Hulu. His TED series landed at Peacock. His future was being built on a different foundation, in a different direction, for a different owner. Family Guy was the thing that kept him tethered to a network he had publicly said he would rather not be on. He was contractually obligated to continue voicing the characters, which he did. But his creative investment, his vision, his sense of ownership over what this thing was, had clearly gone elsewhere. The 2023 Writers Guild of America strike showed his genuine values. He joined the picket lines, as he had during the 2007 to 2008 strike. He made clear that neither he nor the showrunners of Family Guy or American Dad would work while the strike continued. His support for writers was consistent and apparently sincere. But the strike was also another disruption to a production process that had already been through several such disruptions over the years. And disruption, as the show's history had repeatedly demonstrated, was not something that Family Guy's quality had ever been good at surviving. In April 2024, MacFarlane gave an interview in which he addressed the show's future. He said he saw no good reason to stop making it because people still loved it, and it made them happy, and it helped fund causes he cared about, including environmental conservation through organizations like the Rainforest Trust. He noted that the show had reached what he called escape velocity, meaning it had been running so long that continuation required no active justification. He framed the show's existence in terms of financial utility and audience demand rather than creative passion. He did not describe exciting new stories he wanted to tell or new directions he was eager to explore. The show was continuing because it could and because the economics made sense, not because its creator had a burning creative need to keep making it. Then in April 2025 came the announcement of a massive renewal deal with parent company Disney, extending the show through 4 additional seasons, all the way through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. 15 episodes per season. The show was not just surviving, it was being locked in for years into the future by commercial logic that had nothing to do with creative quality. A show can be profitable and be a shadow of what it once was. These two things are not incompatible. They are, in fact, the most common story arc for long-running entertainment franchises. Family Guy is that story. Section 10. The ratings freefall. Numbers do not lie. You can argue about whether a show is still funny. That is a matter of taste, and taste varies genuinely from person to person, and no accounting of it is objective. You can argue about whether the characters are better or worse than they were in earlier seasons, whether the stories are more or less satisfying, whether the humor has maintained its edge or gone soft in the middle. These are matters of opinion, and opinion is legitimate and variable. But there is one dimension of a show's relationship with its audience that is not opinion. Ratings are not opinion. They are factual records of how many people are choosing to spend their time with something. And the ratings history of Family Guy, laid out in sequence from beginning to present, tells a story that has no ambiguous interpretation. When Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, following Super Bowl 33, the first episode pulled in approximately 22 million viewers. The Super Bowl boost is real and should be acknowledged when discussing this number. any show benefiting from that programming inheritance is going to start high. But the first season averaged 12.8 million households and ranked 33rd overall in the Nielsen ratings. For a brand new animated comedy, that was a strong performance that demonstrated genuine audience interest rather than just inherited Super Bowl viewers. The scheduling chaos of seasons 2 and 3, with Fox moving the show repeatedly against Frasier and then against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, produced ratings that reflected the confusion rather than the quality. When the show was finally canceled in 2002, it was not because no one wanted to watch it, it was because no one could find it. The Adult Swim revival and DVD sales demonstrated this clearly. The audience was there all along, waiting for stable access to the show, and the moment it got that access, it showed up in enormous numbers. Season 4, the post-cancellation revival premiere in May 2005, drew 11.85 million viewers for its first episode. The full season averaged around 7.9 million viewers, and this represents the high water mark of the post-revival era. It is the peak from which everything subsequently measured. Season 13, airing from 2014 to 2015, averaged 5.86 million viewers. That is a loss of approximately 2 million people over 9 seasons, which sounds manageable in isolation, but which, when placed in the context of a consistent annual downward trend, indicates something structural rather than cyclical. The audience was not dipping temporarily in response to a weak season or a strong competitor. It was leaving at a rate that was steady and directional and showed no sign of reversing. Season 20, which aired in 2021 and 2022, averaged 1.31 million viewers with a 0.45 rating in the 18 to 49 demographic. From 7.9 million at the revival peak to 1.31 million roughly 16 seasons later. That is a loss of more than 83% of the audience. More than 8 out of every 10 people who had been watching Family Guy in 2005 had stopped watching by 2022. Season 22, which aired in 2023 and 2024, averaged 972,000 viewers. Under 1 million viewers for a show that had once been one of the centerpiece programs of the Fox network. Season 23 tracked similarly through its 2025 run. The show that debuted to 22 million viewers was now attracting fewer viewers per episode than live in many medium-sized American cities. Fox's scheduling decisions reflected this trajectory with a clarity that was almost symbolic. For most of its history, Family Guy had been a Sunday night show, part of the animation domination block that was one of Fox's most prestigious programming assets. Sunday nights were prime real estate, and Family Guy had held a position in that lineup at various times, alongside The Simpsons and American Dad and King of the Hill and Bob's Burgers. In 2019, the show was moved from its longtime 9 o'clock position to the 9:30 slot. In 2023, for the first time since 2002, Family Guy was moved entirely off Sunday nights and given Wednesday nights instead. Wednesday nights. The first time Family Guy had aired on a weekday since its original, troubled, pre-cancellation run. The move was understood by everyone in the television industry as exactly what it was, a demotion. Sunday night is where Fox put its flagship programs. Wednesday night is where it put shows that were still generating enough revenue to justify their production costs, but that were no longer considered essential programming. The show that had once anchored animation domination was now filling a midweek slot that nobody had given much thought to, and yet the show kept being renewed, and kept being renewed in large batches, and in April 2025 was renewed for 4 more seasons in a deal that would extend it to its 30th anniversary. The paradox of a show with cratering ratings getting guaranteed long-term renewal is not actually a paradox when you understand the economics. Animated shows cost a fraction of what live-action shows of comparable notoriety cost to produce. No expensive location shoots, no star salaries for on-screen talent. The voice actors record in booths, the animation is handled overseas by experienced studios. The whole production is lean and cost-effective in ways that live-action production is not. A show can survive a dramatic ratings decline in animation in ways it absolutely cannot in live-action, because the cost structure is different and the revenue from syndication, streaming, and merchandise operates on a different timeline than first-run broadcast viewership. Family Guy on Hulu was one of the most watched shows on the streaming service as recently as 2020. The reruns on Adult Swim, which came back in January 2025 after a several-year absence, quickly returned to their historic position as among the block's top performers. The show streams in markets around the world on Disney+. It generates merchandise revenue from an enormous library of licensed products. The value of the Family Guy brand is not located in how many people watch new episodes on Wednesday nights. It is located in 25 years of content that is perpetually available and perpetually generating revenue across a dozen different platforms and formats. The show exists because the machine that produces it and distributes it and licenses it continues to generate returns that justify the machine's operation. This is not a cynical observation, exactly. It is just an accurate one. And it explains why creative quality became, at some point along the way, a secondary consideration in the show's continued operation. Quality matters for the health of the thing you are making. It does not matter for the health of the business that exists around the thing you are making, at least not past a certain floor. Family Guy cleared that floor long ago. It will keep clearing it, and so it will keep going. Section 11. American Dad did it better. The proof that decline was a choice. Here's the most damaging thing you can say about Family Guy's decline. Not that the characters got worse, although they did. Not that the cutaways took over, although they did. Not that the ratings collapsed, although they did. Not that the creator stepped back and left the show in hands that could maintain it, but not lead it back to what it had been, although all of that happened too. The most damaging thing you can say is that another show made by the same person, started at the same time, on the same network, in the same genre, made different choices and became something significantly better. And that better show is American Dad, and its existence eliminates the most convenient excuse for Family Guy's trajectory. American Dad premiered on February 6, 2005, just 3 months before Family Guy came back from cancellation. Seth MacFarlane created it alongside Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. The show followed the Smith family. Stan Smith, a genuinely delusional CIA patriot who believed in America with a fervor that had stopped interacting with reality in any meaningful way. His wife Francine, who was considerably more functional, but whose past had its own complications. Their kids Haley, a committed liberal who had been fighting with her father since she could form sentences. And Steve, a nerdy teenager whose earnestness operated at a frequency slightly above the world around him. Roger, an alien who had been living in their attic since the Roswell crash. And Klaus, a German-accented goldfish who was actually a man whose brain had been transferred into the fish's body by the CIA. On paper, it sounded like Family Guy with a different household. An ensemble of mismatched personalities, including a non-human character, anchored by a bumbling patriarch built for comedy. In the first couple of seasons, the comparison was not entirely unfair. Early American Dad leaned heavily on Stan's conservatism as its primary comedic engine, and this made the show feel somewhat one-note. The political satire was the point, and the characters were vehicles for it, which was the exact structural problem that Family Guy would later develop with Brian's political soapboxing. Critics were lukewarm. Audiences showed up primarily because the show aired right after Family Guy, and the scheduling made staying on the couch easy. Nobody was arguing American Dad was the better show. And then something happened. American Dad got better. Not gradually and incrementally in the way you might expect from a show finding its feet. Dramatically better. Consistently better. Better in ways that demonstrated that the people making it had found something real and were committed to developing it, rather than simply extracting commercial value from what they had. The show discovered that its most interesting qualities were not Stan's politics, but Stan's psychology, and the psychology of every other character in the house, and the specific and genuinely strange way that all these very different personalities bumped against each other in the confines of a suburban Virginia home. The single most consequential structural decision American Dad made was the one that looks smallest on paper and has the largest implications in practice. It does not use cutaway gags. There is no, "this reminds me of the time" format. There is no snap to an unrelated visual joke and snap back. Everything funny in American Dad has to be funny because of what is happening to these specific people in this specific situation. The writers cannot reach for the cutaway when a scene is not working. They have to make the scene work. This constraint, this productive limitation on the tools available, forced the writing staff to become better storytellers, because storytelling was the only tool they had. The character development in American Dad stands in precise contrast to what happened in Family Guy during the same period. Stan Smith started as a one-dimensional cartoon conservative, less a character than an attitude. The writers allowed him to become more complicated over time while keeping what was essential about him intact. Stan's stubbornness was real and remained real. His delusional faith in the American security apparatus was real and remained real. But alongside these qualities, the writers built genuine love for his family. Genuine humor about his own limitations when he was occasionally forced to confront them. Genuine capacity for change under specific conditions, even if that change was never easy or clean or permanent in the way redemption arcs usually operate in television. Stan could be the villain of an episode and the hero of the next one, and both felt earned because the writers understood him well enough to put him in either role honestly. Roger the Alien became, over the course of the show's run, one of the finest recurring comic creations in American animation. His ability to adopt completely different personas, inhabiting entirely different characters with their own names and backgrounds and relationships to the other Smiths, gave the writers an inexhaustible source of material. Each new Roger persona was a self-contained invention, and because the concept was designed to constantly generate new material, it never exhausted itself. The writers could not run out of ideas for Roger, the way the Family Guy writers concluded they had run out of ideas for evil Stewie, because Roger's concept was specifically constructed to produce new ideas forever. Francine Smith navigated the same structural role as Lois Griffin, the wife holding the household together against a husband whose delusions make things perpetually difficult, and managed not to follow Lois's trajectory into something colder and less caring. She remained capable of genuine warmth and genuine frustration simultaneously, the combination that makes a character feel like a real person rather than a function. The Smith family retained, through the show's many seasons, something that the Griffin family progressively lost: the sense that they actually liked each other, that they would choose each other even if they were not obligated to, that the chaos of their family life was happening to people who wanted to be a family rather than to people who were simply stuck with each other. The show moved from Fox to TBS after its 11th season in 2014. This transition, which could have been destabilizing, turned out to be the opposite. The cable home gave the writers more creative latitude, and the show produced some of its best work in the seasons that followed. Critics and fans who had watched both shows for years began to note openly and with increasing frequency and consensus that American Dad had surpassed Family Guy in quality. Not Family Guy at its best in those first 3 seasons, which remained a benchmark that American Dad never quite hit. But Family Guy in its current state, the show as it actually existed in the present tense, was no longer the better program. The show that had once been dismissed as a Family Guy knockoff had quietly become the standard. The American Dad comparison is the argument that defeats every convenient excuse for Family Guy's decline. The most common defense of the show's current state is that any program will deteriorate after 20+ years, that creative fatigue is an inevitable companion to longevity, that no comedy can sustain its quality over that span of time. There is real truth in this argument as a general principle. But American Dad has been running for the same amount of time. They started in the same year. They came from the same creator. They occupy the same genre on the same network. If long-running animated comedy inevitably declines, American Dad should show comparable signs of that decline. It does not. The argument fails. What the comparison reveals is that decline is not inevitable. It is a choice. Or rather, it is the accumulated result of many individual choices, made by specific people over specific seasons, that each moved the show slightly further from what it had been and slightly closer to what it would eventually become. Family Guy chose to make cutaways the center of the show rather than a feature of it. American Dad chose storytelling. Family Guy chose to push its characters toward extremes that erased what made them recognizable. American Dad chose to develop its characters while maintaining the essential qualities that defined them. Family Guy chose shock and spectacle as its primary registers of humor. American Dad chose to earn its laughs through character and situation. Neither show had to make these choices. Both had the resources and the talent to make different ones. The results reflect the choices that were actually made. Family Guy was once one of the greatest animated comedies ever produced. The golden age was real. Those first 3 seasons were genuinely brilliant, genuinely warm, genuinely original, in ways that had lasting impact on how people thought about animated comedy for adults. The show came back from cancellation not once but twice, the second time through the sheer force of an audience that refused to let go of something it loved. That story is remarkable and belongs to Family Guy and cannot be taken from it. But the golden age ended, not because time erodes quality inevitably, not because success guarantees decline, not because long-running shows are doomed to lose what made them great. It ended because of decisions. The decision to let cutaways replace stories. The decision to turn characters into caricatures of their most extreme traits. The decision to let warmth drain away without replacing it with anything that performed the same function. The decision to keep producing the show after its creator had emotionally moved on, for reasons that had more to do with the economics of entertainment franchises than with anyone's artistic vision. The golden years are still there. Seasons 1 through 3 are still everything they ever were. You can watch them tonight. They are as alive and as funny and as surprisingly moving as they were when they first aired. The history of what came after does not diminish them. It simply makes them more precious for what they were and more instructive about the conditions under which something genuinely great becomes possible. Those conditions are rare and fragile, and they do not last forever. When they are gone, but they leave behind what they made, and what they made, in Family Guy's case, was something that changed television and that people still reach for when they want to remember what the show could do at its best. If you are still here in whatever quiet corner of the night you have found for yourself, thank you. Genuinely. That means something. If this video resonated with you at all, drop a comment, drop a like, and if you want to be here for the next story, subscribe. It is free and it matters more than you might expect. Sleep well wherever you are. End of script. Section 12. The humor shift. From sharp to shock. There is a distinction that sounds simple when you state it plainly, but that is genuinely difficult to maintain over many years and many seasons of television production under commercial pressure. The distinction is between dark humor and shock value. They are not the same thing. They are not even close relatives. They are fundamentally different operations, and confusing them is one of the clearest signs that a comedy show has lost track of what it is trying to do. Dark humor takes something uncomfortable, something that lives in the space between tragedy and absurdity, and finds the precise angle from which that uncomfortable thing reveals something true or unexpected or hilarious. The darkness is not the point. The darkness is the material, and the joke is what the writer does with it. The discomfort creates a kind of pressure, and when the punchline releases that pressure in exactly the right way, the laugh is stronger and more resonant and more meaningful than the laugh produced by something comfortable would be. Dark humor works when the darkness serves the comedy. When the darkness is the comedy, you have something else. You have shock value. Shock value is the direct delivery of something extreme in the expectation that the extremity itself will produce a reaction. Not a laugh necessarily, though it sometimes produces one. A reaction. Something that lands not because it is clever or well-constructed or revelatory, but because it is disturbing or offensive or graphically unpleasant in a way that the human nervous system cannot ignore. Shock value is real in the sense that it genuinely produces a response, but the response is not the same as the response to comedy, and the two should not be confused. Family Guy in its early seasons operated with genuine intelligence in the dark humor space. The show made jokes about religion, politics, race, disability, and a range of other sensitive subjects that could have been deeply offensive if handled carelessly, and that instead were handled with enough wit and specificity to function as actual comedy. The Parents Television Council placed the show on its list of worst primetime programs for family viewing multiple times, including in 2000 and 2005 and 2006, and the Federal Communications Commission received formal complaints asking that the show be blocked from broadcasting. Family Guy was always a show that provoked reactions, but in those early years, the provocation was in service of something. The edge was the delivery system for a joke that had other components. Surprise, precision, an observation that was genuinely correct about something people recognized. The offense was not the joke. The offense was the vehicle. By the middle seasons of the show's run, that relationship had been reversed. The violence in the early seasons was cartoonish in the way that all animated physical comedy is cartoonish. Characters got hurt in exaggerated, impossible ways and bounced back immediately. Peter fell downstairs and stood up. He crashed through walls and shook it off. The chicken fights, those long and increasingly elaborate brawls that broke out periodically between Peter and the giant chicken he had inadvertently offended early in the show's run, were absurdist and over-the-top and funny precisely because they were so committed to their own ridiculousness. Starting around season 8 and accelerating through the following seasons, the violence became something different. Characters were shown with injuries that were drawn with a level of anatomical detail that had no comedic purpose. Exposed brain matter after head injuries, eyeballs dangling from sockets, severe wounds rendered with enough realism that they stopped reading as cartoon violence and started reading as something that belonged in a different and much darker genre of entertainment. These images were not making points. They were not building to punchlines that recontextualized them or justified them. They were simply extreme, and the show presented them in comedy context as though extremity and comedy were interchangeable, which they are not. The gross-out humor followed the same trajectory. In the early seasons, bodily humor appeared occasionally as a quick moment in a larger joke structure. The gross thing was a single note in a chord, and the chord was the joke. In the later seasons, the gross thing became the entire joke. Entire scenes were built around sustained physical disgust with no punchline other than the continued presence of the disgusting thing. The show seemed to have concluded that if an audience can be made sufficiently uncomfortable, that discomfort is equivalent to entertainment. This is a misunderstanding of how audiences work and what they want. And the ratings data over those seasons reflected their response to it. The political humor went through a parallel degradation. Early Family Guy's political jokes were balanced in a way that allowed the show to satirize across the ideological spectrum without seeming to have a consistent partisan agenda. The humor landed because it was about recognizing something true about human behavior, about institutions, about the way power operates, and that kind of truth recognition humor works regardless of where on the political spectrum its targets happen to fall. Later, Family Guy's political humor was increasingly one-sided and increasingly topical in a way that aged badly. Jokes tied to specific politicians and specific scandals or from specific moments in political time have an expiration date built into them. A joke about a political controversy from 2015 is not funny in 2025 because the context that made it topical has dissolved into the noise of subsequent events. The early seasons made jokes that were still funny 10 years later. The later seasons made jokes that were barely funny in the week they aired. The fourth wall breaking became pervasive in a way that was revealing about the show's relationship to its own quality. In the early seasons, characters acknowledging that they were in a television show happened rarely and with specific purpose, usually as a single sharp punctuation mark at the end of a joke that had been building in a different direction. In the later seasons, fourth wall breaks became a constant feature. Characters referenced the show's own declining quality. They made jokes about how long Family Guy had been running. They acknowledged explicitly that the show was not as good as it used to be and that this was widely understood. These self-deprecating meta-jokes were sometimes genuinely funny. But a show that makes jokes about its own decline is not the same as a show that is fixing its decline. The awareness and the action are different things. And when the awareness produces no action, when the show simply keeps doing what it has been doing, while also making jokes about doing it, the self-awareness starts to feel like another form of abdication. There is something almost tragic in the show's relationship to its own history. The people making it, the writers who were there every day crafting the scripts, clearly understood what the show had been. They had seen the early episodes. They knew the difference between what Family Guy was capable of and what it was currently producing. The gap between knowledge and action, between understanding that something is wrong and choosing to fix it, is one of the saddest things about the show's decline. And it is a gap that the humor itself kept highlighting without ever crossing. Section 13. What remains? The legacy and the lessons. When the dust settles on a story this long and this complicated, there are two things worth holding onto simultaneously, because both of them are true and neither of them cancels the other out. The first thing is that Family Guy, in its original form in those first 3 seasons and scattered throughout the early revival years, was genuinely exceptional. It was not exceptional in the way that everything is called exceptional by people who do not want to make distinctions. It was exceptional in the precise, measurable sense that it did things no other show was doing, that it created characters who had no equivalents elsewhere, that it found a specific register of humor and heart and executed it with intelligence and commitment. The show that premiered after Super Bowl 33 in January 1999 was something new. It changed how people thought about what animated adult comedy could look and feel like. It built an audience so fiercely devoted that those fans spent 3 years keeping the memory of it alive and ultimately resurrected it from the dead through sheer collective investment. You do not do that for something mediocre. You do that for something that mattered. Stewie Griffin, in his original form, is one of the most genuinely original characters ever created for American television. The specific combination of infant appearance and adult malevolence, played completely straight without irony or wink, produced comedy that has never been replicated in the years since. Brian Griffin, in his original form, was the kind of character people recognize in themselves and in people they love, a person trying to be better than he is and falling short in specific and recognizable ways. Peter Griffin, before the Flanderization, was the best version of the lovable fool archetype, elevated by the warmth underneath the stupidity. The early show created these people and loved them, and the audience loved them back. The second thing worth holding is equally true and less comfortable. The show chose to stop being that. Not all at once and not through any single catastrophic decision, but through the accumulation of choices that moved it, season by season, away from what it had been. The characters were pushed into extremes that erased the qualities that made them lovable. The storytelling gave way to cutaway dependency. The warmth drained away. The creator stepped back. The commercial logic took over from the creative logic. And what remained, by the later seasons, was a shell of something that had once been great, still recognizable in its basic outlines, still capable of occasional excellence, but operating at a fraction of its former capacity and declining steadily against every metric that measures how connected a show is to the audience it once held. The lessons here, if lessons are useful, are fairly direct. Quality requires sustained investment from people who understand why something works and are willing to protect it, even when protecting it is expensive or inconvenient. Success is not the same as health. A show can be commercially successful while creatively deteriorating, and the commercial success can mask the deterioration for so long that by the time the decline is visible in the ratings, it has been going on for years. The conditions that produce something genuinely great are rare and fragile and not easily replicated once they are gone. When a creator builds something and then steps away from it, something is lost that cannot be replaced by any amount of competence in the people who come after. None of this makes Family Guy's golden years less golden. The episodes from those first 3 seasons still exist. They are still sharp and funny and warm in the specific way that the show at its best always was. They will always be available for anyone who wants to remember or discover what this show was capable of. The decline that followed does not reach back and change what those episodes were. It just makes watching them more poignant now, knowing what came after, knowing that the conditions that produced them were temporary and ultimately unrepeatable. Family Guy did not just get worse. It chose to get worse through decisions made by real people in real rooms. And then it chose to keep going, driven by economics rather than art, for reasons that had nothing to do with whether anyone was excited about the stories being told. That is its legacy, taken whole. The golden age and the long decline together. Both true, both part of the same story. Thank you for spending this time here. If this reached you wherever you are, in whatever quiet you have found tonight, I hope it was worth it. Leave a comment, leave a like, and subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. Sleep well.